Before we start, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Maybe you're going through your own dark night of the soul. Maybe you're searching for meaning in a world that feels increasingly empty. Maybe you're successful by every external measure, but still feel hollow inside. This conversation is going to be different from anything I've shared before. I'm going to tell you about the night I hit rock bottom spiritually and how a book I hadn't touched since childhood became the foundation for everything that came after. I'm going to share what I discovered in the pages of scripture during those sleepless nights when the weight of existence felt too heavy to bear. Most people know me for rockets and electric cars, but what they don't know is that behind every major decision I've made, behind every impossible goal I've pursued, there's been a spiritual foundation that most people never see. Today, I want to tell you about that foundation, about the nights when I wrestled with God like Jacob at Peniel, about the ancient words that spoke to modern problems, about the peace I found in the darkest chapters of my life. By the end of this conversation, you might understand why I believe faith isn't the enemy of reason, it's the completion of it. Why the Bible isn't just an ancient book, it's a living guide for navigating the deepest questions of human existence. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2019. I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the ceiling for hours, checking my phone obsessively, trapped in a spiral of thoughts I couldn't escape. On paper, everything in my life was working. Companies were thriving, projects were advancing, the world was taking notice of what we were building. But inside I felt empty, hollow, like I was performing a role in someone else's play. The loneliness was crushing. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone. I was surrounded by brilliant people working on meaningful projects. This was existential loneliness. The kind that comes from feeling disconnected from any larger purpose, any deeper meaning, any sense that what you're doing matters beyond the immediate metrics of success. I had been wrestling with questions that kept me awake night after night. Why are we here? What's the point of any of this? If we're just biological machines running chemical programs, why does consciousness feel so significant? Why does beauty move us? Why do we hunger for meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to our existence? The rational, scientific part of my mind had answers, of course. Evolution, neuroscience, emergent complexity. But those answers felt hollow at 3 a.m. when I was confronting the raw fact of my own mortality and the apparent meaninglessness of everything I was trying to build. That night, something broke inside me. I realized that all my achievements, all my plans for the future, all my grand visions for humanity, they were built on a foundation of sand. Without some deeper purpose, some connection to something larger than myself, what was the point? I found myself walking to my bookshelf, not entirely sure what I was looking for. And there, wedged between books on physics and philosophy, was a Bible, an old one with worn edges and yellowed pages. I couldn't even remember how it had gotten there. I opened it randomly to the book of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. I almost closed the book right there. The last thing I needed was a story about some ancient righteous person who had his life figured out. But something made me keep reading. As I read about Job's losses, his wealth, his children, his health, his friends' support, I felt something I hadn't expected: recognition. Here was someone who had built something meaningful, who had done everything right according to the standards of his time, and yet found himself stripped of everything that gave his life structure and meaning. But it wasn't Job's losses that gripped me. It was his questions. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul? These weren't the questions of someone who had lost faith. These were the questions of someone wrestling with the deepest mysteries of existence. Someone refusing to accept easy answers or comfortable platitudes. The first time in months, I felt less alone. I read through the entire book that night. Job's friends trying to explain his suffering with neat theological formulas. Job rejecting their explanations and demanding a direct encounter with the voice from the whirlwind that doesn't answer Job's questions but transforms them into something larger. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. This wasn't the God of comfortable religion or simple answers. This was the God of fundamental mystery, of questions that reshaped the questioner, of a universe so vast and complex that human understanding could only touch the edges. By sunrise, something had shifted inside me. I was still the same person with the same questions, but I no longer felt like I was asking them alone. Over the following weeks, I found myself returning to the Bible every morning around 3 a.m., not as a religious exercise, but as a continuation of the conversation that had started that first night. I wasn't reading it the way I had been taught as a child, looking for moral lessons or rules to follow. I was reading it like I read scientific papers, looking for patterns, insights, truths that could illuminate the problems I was trying to solve. What I found surprised me. The Bible wasn't a book of easy answers. It was a book of profound questions. Abraham arguing with God about justice, Moses demanding to see God's face, David crying out in abandonment, the disciples constantly misunderstanding what they were witnessing. These weren't stories about people who had faith figured out. They were stories about people wrestling with the same fundamental questions that kept me awake at night. Questions about purpose, meaning, suffering, death, and what it means to be human in a universe that often seems hostile to human flourishing. But there was something else in these stories, a persistent thread of hope, not the shallow optimism that everything will work out fine, but something deeper, a conviction that existence itself is meaningful, that consciousness is a gift rather than an accident, that the human search for purpose reflects something real about the nature of reality. 3 weeks into my 3 a.m. Bible reading, I discovered Ecclesiastes. If Job was the book of suffering, Ecclesiastes was the book of existential emptiness. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Here was someone who had tried everything, wisdom, pleasure, work, relationships, wealth, and found it all ultimately meaningless. Someone who looked at the human condition with unflinching honesty and saw the futility that haunts every human achievement. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after wind. This could have been devastating. Instead, it was liberating. For the first time, I was reading something that acknowledged what I had been feeling without trying to fix it or explain it away. The preacher wasn't offering solutions. He was validating the problem. But then came the turn. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. The meaninglessness wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of meaning. Not meaning that could be grasped or achieved, but meaning that could be received moment by moment as a gift. Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. This wasn't about earning meaning through achievement. It was about discovering meaning that was already there, woven into the fabric of existence itself. As my 3 a.m. reading continued, I found myself drawn to Genesis. Not the creation story I thought I knew from childhood, but something much more profound. In the beginning, God created the heavens, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. I began to see this not just as a story about how the physical universe began, but as a pattern for how all creation works. Something from nothing, order from chaos, light from darkness. Every project I had ever worked on followed the same pattern. Every breakthrough began with a problem without a darkness that seemed impenetrable. And then, somehow, there would be light, not through my effort alone, but through something that felt like participation in a larger creative process. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Creation by speech. Reality responding to intention expressed through words. This resonated with everything I knew about how ideas become real, how articulating a vision clearly enough can actually bring it into existence. But the part that stopped me was this. God saw that the light was good. Creation wasn't just functional, it was good. There was an aesthetic dimension to reality, a beauty that wasn't just useful but inherently valuable. This spoke to something I had always felt but couldn't articulate, that the universe contains beauty that serves no evolutionary purpose, complexity that goes beyond what survival requires. After months of reading the Hebrew scriptures, I turned to the Gospels. I thought I knew these stories, but reading them at 3 a.m. with questions about consciousness and meaning, they revealed layers I had never seen. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John's Gospel opened with something that sounded almost like information theory. The fundamental nature of reality wasn't matter or energy, it was logos, word, information, meaning. This connected with something I had been thinking about for years. Consciousness seems to be the universe's way of understanding itself. We're not separate from the cosmos. We're the part of the cosmos that can think, that can ask questions, that can create meaning. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Here was a statement about the fundamental nature of reality. Consciousness, meaning light, these weren't fragile accidents that would eventually be extinguished. They were fundamental features of existence itself. But it was Jesus's teachings about love that really challenged me. Not sentimental love, but something much more radical. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This wasn't just moral advice. It was a prescription for how consciousness can transform reality. Love as the force that breaks cycles of conflict and creates possibilities that didn't exist before. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Self-sacrifice as the highest form of love. This contradicted everything I'd learned about evolutionary psychology, about the selfish gene, about survival of the... Yet it pointed to something I recognized in the deepest human experiences, that the moments when people transcend self-interest are often the moments when life feels most meaningful. 6 months into my biblical journey, I discovered Paul's letters, particularly Romans 8. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Paul was writing about hope, but not the kind of hope that denies present suffering. He was writing about hope that transforms suffering into something meaningful without eliminating it. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. This wasn't a promise that everything would turn out fine. It was a claim that even the worst experiences could be woven into a larger pattern of meaning, but only for those who were aligned with something beyond their own immediate desires. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. This was a statement about the fundamental structure of reality. Love wasn't just an emotion or a human invention, it was the force that holds everything together, the deepest truth about what exists. But the passage that changed everything was Romans 1:20. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. The universe itself was a revelation. Every law of physics, every mathematical relationship, every instance of beauty or complexity was a glimpse into the nature of whatever was behind it all. I realized I had been reading the Bible wrong my entire life. It wasn't separate from science or reason, it was the completion of science and reason. It was asking the questions that science couldn't ask and pointing toward answers that logic alone couldn't reach. As my understanding deepened, I found myself spending more and more time in the Psalms. Here was raw human emotion directed toward the divine: anger, fear, gratitude, despair, joy, confusion. My God, why have you forsaken me? David wasn't afraid to bring his worst feelings to God. This wasn't sanitized religion. This was honest relationship with whatever was ultimately real. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. But it was Psalm 139 that undid me completely. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. The idea that consciousness, that each individual human being was not an accident, but an intention. That the complexity of the human brain, the mystery of subjective experience, the capacity for love and creativity and wonder, all of this was intended, was wanted, was good. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. This became my prayer. Not asking for certainty or easy answers, but acknowledging that I was encountering something larger than my ability to understand, and being grateful for the encounter itself. Those months of 3 a.m. reading didn't convert me to a particular denomination or convince me to follow a specific set of religious practices. But they did something more fundamental. They restored my sense that existence itself is meaningful. I began to see my work differently, not as an attempt to prove my worth or achieve immortality through accomplishment, but as participation in something larger. An opportunity to add something beautiful to the universe, to solve problems that reduce suffering, to create possibilities that didn't exist before. The loneliness that had driven me to the Bible in the first place began to lift, not because I was no longer alone, but because I realized I had never been alone. Consciousness itself is a form of connection to the universe that produced it, to the mystery that sustains it, to the love that calls it into being. My relationships improved because I was no longer trying to get meaning from them. I could give more freely because I wasn't depleted by the fear that this was all there was. Even my approach to failure changed. Setbacks became part of a larger story rather than evidence that the story was meaningless. People sometimes ask me why I think the Bible spoke to me when other books didn't. I think it's because the Bible doesn't try to solve the problem of human existence, it tries to transform it. Philosophy analyzes the human condition, science explains it, religion often tries to escape it, but the Bible engages with it directly, honestly, without flinching from the darkness or the mystery. It presents a universe where consciousness is not an accident, but a gift, where suffering is real but not ultimate, where love is not just a chemical reaction, but the fundamental force that binds everything together. Whether you believe these claims, literally or metaphorically, almost doesn't matter. What matters is whether they help you live with more courage, more compassion, more wonder at the mystery of being alive. If I could go back to that night when I first opened the Bible in desperation, here's what I would tell myself. You're not looking for answers, you're looking for the right questions. You're not seeking certainty, you're seeking meaning. You're not trying to solve the mystery of existence. You're trying to participate in it. The emptiness you feel isn't evidence that life is meaningless. It's evidence that you were made for something larger than what you've been settling for. The questions that keep you awake aren't problems to be solved. They're invitations to a conversation that will last the rest of your life. The God you'll encounter in these pages isn't the God of easy answers or comfortable religion. It's the God of burning bushes and wrestling matches, of unanswered prayers and unexpected grace. Discover that faith isn't the opposite of doubt. It's what happens when you keep wrestling with the questions that matter most. I'm not trying to convert anyone to Christianity or any other religion. I'm simply sharing what I found when I was desperate enough to look beyond the materialist explanations that had sustained me for decades. If you're going through your own dark night of the soul, if you're successful by every external measure but feel hollow inside, if you're asking questions that science can answer but somehow not satisfy, maybe it's time to read an ancient book with new eyes. Start anywhere. Job, if you're suffering. Ecclesiastes, if you're struggling with meaninglessness. Genesis, if you're curious about creation. The Gospels, if you want to understand love. Read it at 3 a.m. when your defenses are down and your need is real. Read it not looking for rules to follow, but for reality to encounter. You might find what I found, that the universe is stranger and more meaningful than our current paradigms can explain. That consciousness is a gift rather than an accident. That love is the force that holds everything together. Or you might find something completely different. But you'll find something, because anyone honest enough to ask the deepest questions is already on their way to discovering that those questions have been asked before by people who found themselves held by something larger than their ability to understand. The 3 a.m. hour is when the soul speaks most honestly. What is your soul trying to tell you? Share this with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if these conversations help you wrestle with the questions that matter most. And remember, the questions that disturb your sleep might be exactly what your life is calling you to explore. The Bible is waiting. So is the conversation that could change everything.